Good evening, everyone. Welcome. Tonight we are going to have a presentation from Ray Silva. He lives in Bloomington area. He's a retired chemical engineer from Massachusetts. He's lived in Virginia, Illinois, then moved to Georgia, and he's came back to Illinois. His main interests out of the nature photography are astrophotography and landscapes. He's currently a member of our club, the Photographic Society of America, and a board member of the Georgia Nature Photographers Association and the Twin Cities Amateur Astronomers. He's exhibited in galleries from Chicago to Savannah, and he's conducted classes on digital photography. He's presented programs to photo clubs, including this one tonight. He has a Facebook page, Silva Image Photography. His Instagram is found under Ray Silva, and he also has a site on Fine Art America found under Ray Silva. He is going to talk tonight about long exposure photography. So let's give a welcome to Ray Silva. Take it away, Ray. Thank you.
Because of the mask, I want to make sure everybody can hear all the way back, so I'll use the microphone for the most part. This presentation, I've given this in the past, but I've updated it in the last couple of months here for this group here. I'm going to talk about long exposure, but next slide, please. The definition of long exposure could be any number of definitions, but I'm calling it time exposure, slow shuttering photography. It's a long duration of shutter speed. It captures stationary elements, and while other items might be blurring or smearing in the photo. This happens to be a beach, a pier, stationary object. You see the horizon there, and this is a tide going out. Okay, next. Some consider long exposure to be a quarter second in time or longer. Okay, next. Or the use of a tripod. Okay, next. Or the use of a neutral density filter. Okay. Or a combination of two of the three. In this case, I used a tripod. I did not use a neutral density filter. This is a small waterfall. It happens to be in New Hampshire. Right there?
Yeah. New Hampshire.
Okay. This is the basin area. Okay? Okay, shutter speed is a key factor in long exposure. This is Milky Way, of course. This typically would be somewhere around 20 to 30 second exposure. Okay, next. Okay, any exposure that does not stop motion, I would suggest is a long exposure image. We're still in New Hampshire. This happens to be a mill stream, and this here is probably somewhere in the order of 2 or 3 seconds exposure. I don't remember the exact time here, but you can see we're downstream. You see the swirling of the water below the dam. Okay. Let's review the exposure triangle. How many people shoot in manual mode? We've got some. Okay, that's good. We're going to talk about shutter, aperture, and ISO. The people who use manual mode are very familiar with these combinations. Other people might use a aperture priority, or perhaps shutter priority, or they might have it in program mode or P, automatic mode. Okay? Typically, you want to use manual mode because you have some control over your shutter speed. Okay, next. Okay, aperture. We can go from a f2.8, 4, 5, 6, 8, 11, 16, 22. As we go up to the higher numbers here, your aperture is getting smaller. So it's allowing less light in. Down here, it's more light. Okay? For ISO, again, typically we'll have anywhere from 100 all the way up to 12,800, even higher today, perhaps. But lower down here is less sensitive, up to more sensitive sensor. Okay? Some cameras will go below 100. I've got a Canon system, and I typically will use an ISO of 50. For Nikon, I believe 64 is the lowest, and I'm not sure about Sony, what their lowest ISO rating is. But again, more sensitive here, the higher level, less sensitive to the low one. Okay, next please. Okay, we're talking about shutter speed. Okay, we can go from anywhere an eighth of a second all the way up to 4,000ths a second, but typically 4,000ths or 2,000, we don't even worry about that. But as far as the time goes, we can go much longer than an eighth of a second. We can go down to 1 second, or even 30 seconds, or 5 minutes, or an hour, for instance. But these are all related here. Okay, next. The main thing we want to focus on is the shutter speed. Okay, we want to control the shutter speed. Okay, next please. Typically a quarter second or longer, so really anything below here. But if we have a quarter of a second or longer, that's going to let more light in. We may want that, or we may not, but we will want to control the amount of light coming in, since we're going to hold it about a quarter second or so. So we have to play around with the aperture or ISO. Okay, next. Okay, technical considerations. We might want to make sure we have a secure tripod. You want to make sure the camera is setting still. It could be a tripod, it could be a tabletop, or anything that's secure. Tripods are preferential because you can move that around and you know that it's locked in and it's secure. But it could be a car hood if you don't have a tripod around, or a brick or a post, anything like that might do. Make sure it's way down, and make sure that you can kind of push it down on the ground to make sure it's secure. Okay? Next. For those people who have a DSLR, of course there's a mirror in the back there. You want to use the lockup feature for a DSLR. So that means you got one click, the mirror comes up, another click will be taking exposure. But here's your advantage of the mirrorless camera. You don't have to worry about that shutter shape for the mirror. Okay, next. Off-camera shutter release. You can use a cord or cordless. There's a lot of wireless instruments around, so you want to make sure there's no shaking in the camera at all. Next. You want to block or cover up the viewfinder to prevent any light from being recorded in the sensor. This is true for a DSLR. You don't realize the light will get to your sensor from the back viewing piece. So if you're going to have, say, in daylight, I typically use a ball cap and just put it over there for the time of exposure, especially if it's a longer exposure. But I've known people that have gone out, taking some long exposures, all excited. They get home, they open it up on their computer screen, and all of a sudden these ghost images, but basically it's light coming in and contaminating the sensor from the back side. So keep that in mind. Some cameras come with a little blocker. I think Nikon has a built-in block, so which is nice. I like that picture of Nikon, but I don't have Nikon. So I've got to be aware of that when I shoot. But here is, again, your advantage of your mirrorless sensor. You don't have to worry about that. Okay, Steve, thank you. Okay, bulk mode, or B mode, is for exposures over 30 seconds. Most cameras will let you go to 30-second exposure, but in case you want to have a longer than that, you're going to have to switch your dial to a B mode or bulk mode, in which case you hold down your shutter for as long as you need. You can use a wristwatch or any other kind of timer if you want to do a minute, 2 minutes, 5 minutes, but basically it'll have to be in a bulb mode. Okay? Okay, here's a shutter release as an example here. This is after Buchanan. Intervalometer is here, which is a little fancier contraption. You can have this set up taking an exposure every 5 seconds, 10 seconds, or 20 seconds on a continuous basis for as many times as you tell it to. And again, here's a sturdy tripod with a head. Make sure it's weighted down. Some people might want to have a bag or to hold the base down so it doesn't move, depending on how the conditions are. It may be windy that day, so you may want to be concerned about that. Okay, next. Okay, equipment recommendations as far as filters go. Most people are familiar with the UV or clear skylight filters. This will allow basically all the light to come through. Polarizing filters, some people are aware of these. You can turn them, rotate them to dim the amount of light coming through or polarized light. This is about a 2-stop, typically for a polarizing filter. And there's a series of neutral density filters, but basically it's a smoky filter, and they come at different levels, and I'll show you some examples of those. Some solid neutral density filters are square. Lee system, which I have here and I use. Here's a graduated neutral density filter, where you have a dark side and it gradually comes to no filter at all. And you can go from say 2-stop, or say 3-stop, 2-stop, and 1-stop here. And this is helpful if you're doing horizons, where the sky above the horizon line may be lighter, generally lighter. So what you want to do is block that sunlight here by taking and have this being on high end of the horizon, and this being with the ground covered. There are some variable neutral density filters here, where basically it's one filter and you rotate it and it gets increasingly darker and darker. I've had some experience with it. I bought one. I had trouble getting some good results, and I don't know where it is today, but I did away with it. I used basically the solid ones, the square ones, or even the round ones. Okay, next. Okay, this happens to be a Hoya 77 millimeter. That's what my lens is. Density of 0.9, which is 3 stops. So for instance, if you have an exposure and you put the filter on, you'll have to increase the exposure by 3 stops, meaning that the wheel, 9 clicks. You're letting more light in. Okay? Here's another one here, neutral density. This is the variable. You can go to 0.45 to 2.7. So 1.5 stops and 9 stops. And again, I didn't have any luck, but it may be the brand, but I ended up going with some standard neutral density filters. But variable ones are available. Okay, next. The equipment that I've used, I've read a lot about, a lot of information, is the Lee filter system. Basically, it's a rectangular filter. You need a bracket. You need another converter that will screw on the front side of your camera lens, and you attach your bracket to there, and the bracket has some slides. You can add 1 and 2 different types of neutral density filters depending on what your selection is. This one has to be a graduated one. Say, for instance, this person would take this and slide this up and down and have the horizon line be right here. This happens to be a graduated, a soft one. Some have a hard line. But it depends on what your situation is. You may want to have one or the other. Here's another example of a full setup. I've got one set up here. You're welcome to come up and take a look at it and see what it looks like. But basically, you can set up with one or two filters in there. I've got one that's also a polarizer. It's not a circular polarizer because it's not circular. But basically, what happens is you can put your regular filter in there, put a polarized filter in here, and take this whole bracket and rotate it just like you would a polarized lens. So your image would be going through the glass through here, and it really wouldn't know the orientation of this filter, whether it be 45 degree or 90 degrees. But as long as you're covered here, your lens is covered, you can get a good polarizing result. Okay? Okay, I'm going to give you a quiz on this later on. Anybody questions? Yeah? No? Okay. Feel free to raise your hand or yell and let me know.
What is your favorite neutral density number of stops that you use?
I'm going to say it all depends on what I'm shooting. On the way over here, I stopped over at Lakewood Woods, and it was cloudy, and it started to rain, but I had a filter on there. Because it was raining, I put everything back, and I went around the corner, and all of a sudden the sun broke out, the clouds. I was by the golf course, and I ended up taking some pictures. You'll see it in a few minutes. But I used the 10th stop on that, and also a polarizer on it. So that came up to a total of 12 stop. Now, I wouldn't use a 12 stop. I went by the river, and 10 stop was far too much. So I had to go down to a 6 stop. To get an image that I want. So it really depends what you're shooting and how much light you have available. You want to get that shutter speed down low. So you might go at a 10, and I'll show you something in a few minutes. I'll show you a 15 stop. And it depends what you're looking for, but I can't say I have a favorite one. Whatever one that does the job. So you might, that's why I have a series of filters, because I don't know what I might use for that situation. And I might use different ones and get back and take a look at them and see which one I like better. That's a good question though. Anybody else? No? Okay, this is just an example here. Say the original shutter speed, if you have a 1 second shutter speed here, okay, and you have a neutral density filters, stops. Okay, if you have none, of course, it's still one second exposure. So 1 stop here, 1 second goes to 2 seconds here. Okay, say if it's 1 second originally, and you put a 7 stop, your exposure is going to be 2 minutes. Okay, then it goes on down. Say if you had a 12 stop here, you have an hour exposure. But all this here would be all equivalent exposures. Because you're reducing the amount of light in there. Because you're reducing the amount of light, you have to extend the shutter speed time. I don't know how many, I haven't tried anything in an hour. The most I've gone, I think, was about 8 minutes. That's why the most patience I had. But you can actually go higher than an hour if need be. Okay, Steve?
Ray, I have a question about that. So when you have the filter on the front of your camera, instead of doing math and all that, because I really don't want to do that, can you just use the back of the screen where it shows you where, can you use that, or is that not accurate with the filter on there?
Yeah, you can use your live view, take a look at it. But live view sometimes won't work if it's too dark, heavier filter. You can go to an app on your phone,
Okay.
and it'll tell you, okay, your original shutter speed is, and the exposure, and it'll automatically give you not automatically, but you can read off how many seconds or minutes it'll take to give it equivalent exposure.
So even the little diagram where you're supposed to put it in the center, that won't
Yeah.
work very well either?
Yeah, in
Okay.
fact, Lee filters, this little pouch here, it has a little tag in there like a postcard, but basically it'll give you the equivalence there. But, you know, I'll go to my iPhone here, I got a app in there, and I'll dial it up. Lee has it, but there's other ones that have equivalents.
But Ray, I don't think the through the lens meter is gonna work once you get into the higher, exposure times.
Right, exactly.
It can't see
Right.
cutting that.
Yeah, in fact, you want to focus your camera before you put a filter on there. Because once you put a filter in there, your camera's going to have trouble trying to focus. So you want to focus first, then put take your exposure. In fact, take an exposure, and then from that, go back and you can calculate how long you need for the correct exposure.
You still see that's kind of a trial and error. I mean,
Yeah, there's some still trial and error because there's different factors in there that you'll find out. For instance, on Lake of the Woods today, I had about 3 or 4 different exposures before I got what I wanted. But you never know until you see it at the back of the screen, the LCD, to see what you have. In this case here, 1 second exposure, I've got a three stop, and it'll take 8 seconds. Now, I might take an exposure and I just might decide, okay, I'll go to a 10 seconds, or maybe I'll go back to 6 seconds or 4, but you've got to tweak it. The other thing is, if you're outside, you have light moving all around. You get clouds. That's one of the things I was struggling here with. Had clouds coming by, had 1 exposure, the clouds came by, I didn't get the exposure I thought I would because the clouds kind of limited the light. So you've got to do some trial and error, but you've been in photography long enough to know trial and error is sometimes the way to go. Okay? Okay, in this case here, we've got a 10 stop here, and you'll hear a lot about the 10 stop. And here's a 16-minute exposure. The other thing, if we're talking about some longer exposures, you want to make sure you have a battery in here that's charged, and maybe a backup too, because after a while, you're going to find out that your battery's drained, and you might be stuck out somewhere without any more juice to work with. And make sure you get an extra battery backup. Okay, next. Okay, this is different shutter speeds here. This is the stops of light reduction here, all the way down to 10 here. This is the neutral density of 3. And you can look these up. I just put them out just to give you an idea of what different combinations there might be out there. Okay, next. Okay, in this case here, we want 2 stops reduction. We'll put a neutral density of 0.6. That's 4 stops of the light. So we go from, with the clear, we've got 0, and 4 stops is 1/4 of a second. Okay? Next. Okay, in this case, we have a 10 stop filter on here. It's a neutral density of 3.0. And this is what we're doing here. Light is reduced by 1/1024. Okay, we'll see what happens when we use that 10 stop. Okay, next. Okay, this happens to be an app I use on my phone. I'm using a 3-stop neutral density 8. Okay, originally it's a 1/30th of a second without any filter. But with the filter, it's 1/4 of a second. I mean, if people like to do the math, it's fine. But I like to kind of flip this out and check right away. Okay, next. This happens to be a Lee app. Their sixth stop is called little stopper. Okay, with the normal shutter speed and with a little stopper. So my normal shutter speed exposure is 1/60th of a second. With this little stopper, which 6 stops, is 1 second. This might be some bright conditions, but if you want a 1 second exposure with a little stopper, your original setup is 1/60th of a second. Okay? Okay, now we go to the big stopper. This is the one that's a 10th stop. Okay, if we originally had 1/50th of a second, it's going to take 1 minute of exposure for an equivalent with the 10th stop. You'll probably hear a lot about the 10th stop filters. But you can also go to a 15 stop. They make a 15 stop, but I've got a little stopper and a big stopper. What I end up doing is putting them back to back, a 6 and a 10, if I want to have some exaggerated exposures. Again, this is an app. It's pretty handy. Okay, next. Okay. I wasn't thinking about it, but this is appropriate today. Manchester, New Hampshire. I'm taking a series of photos, but this is the location. It's called the Overlook. On the west side of the falls of the Amaskeet, named the place of many fishes by the Pennacook Indians. Indigenous, right? Indigenous thing. 1839, John and Henry Thoreau were passing through here in a small boat. They built themselves. And all of a sudden, they flipped over, and we locked ourselves through here with much to do, surrounding water steps of this river staircase in the midst of a crowd of villagers. Well, it happened to be the native or indigenous people. And they jumped in, the canal basically saved them, but it was recorded in A Week of the Concord of the Merrimack Rivers by A.T. Thoreau. I thought it was interesting. This today had this little story about the Penguin. And who are the immigrants? Well, I guess the immigrants of the Thoreaus. Okay. Okay, this is the river itself. I've got a series of time exposures, and we talked about numbers and filters before. We'll give you some examples. Okay, next, please. Okay, I've taken a series of exposures with a 10 stop neutral density filter. This is the big stopper. I set up with a f-stop of 16, and the ISO changed, and here's the shutter speed. It started with 30 seconds, all the way up to a quarter of a second. Or, yeah, quarter of a second. Okay? Next. Okay, this is 30-second exposure with a 10 stop neutral density filter. Okay, next. Okay, change in ISO a little bit. See a little bit different in the ripples. Next. This is a 15-second exposure. Okay, next. 8 second. Next. 4 second exposure. Next. 2 second. Notice the turbulence in the river. Okay, next. 1 second. Okay, next. Half. Okay, one more. Here's a quarter here. Okay, one more. And this will give you an idea side by side what it looks like. Now the question is, which one's your favorite? Now, is this everybody's favorite, or is this one here, or is that one there? It all depends on what you're feeling. But you can use the same 10 stop by adjusting your ISO and your shutter speed here to get these different effects.
Ray, did you have your ISO set to auto when you did this, or did you
No,
manually?
I set them, it was not ISO auto. I adjusted it to get an equivalent exposure. So these are all equivalent exposure. So if you do the math and look at that for the second, for F16, ISO 160, 30 seconds, they should all be the same histogram, basically. I wanted to do that so you can look at them side by side and say, they're all the correct exposure, but we get there differently, different time. Now, some people like the quarter second here because you can see some motion in the water here, where here it's so smooth, but again, it's personal preference. Okay, next, Steve. Okay, here's again another example of side by side. Even between a half second to a quarter second, you see a little difference here. But you know it's an exposure, a longer exposure, because it's blurred. Okay, next. Okay, what I did with the same 10 stop, I changed the f-stop from 16, 11, and 8. I kept the ISO at 320 with a shutter speed 30, 15, and 8. Okay. This is a 30 second. There's some rocks in the river. Okay, next. 15 seconds. Okay, next. 8 seconds. I should say, yeah, 8 seconds. Okay, next. And here's the difference between all three. Now, which one do you like best? You know, it's really up to you. It's what you're feeling like that day. I kind of like this one a little bit so I can see more of the ripples and flow of the water. But no, they're all right. There's no wrong one there.
But if you don't know that it's water, when you're just looking at the picture, you can see several different things.
Right?
So that, yeah, one looks like snowbird way over on the side. I don't know what you just
Right.
got. Yeah, I like that. That's pretty.
This particular one, I used a 70 to 200 millimeter lens. I had it zoomed out so I could get pretty close. I typically wouldn't take this for myself, but just use for demonstration purposes. Okay, Steve, next. Okay, here's 1 second here. Here's the 8 second. Here's the 1 second. Okay, next. Okay. I took a series of a building here. This happens to be, I think this is Manchester at ISU. I took this, I think, last week. I've got a F16 ISO 50. Went as low as I could. F16, which is not the smallest aperture, but for this exposure here, I got 1/40 of a second. This particular day, it cleared up. The sky came out pretty nice. I was pretty happy about it. The wind wasn't blowing. It was just a really light breeze. But anyways, this is I'd say, pretty good exposure. This is no filters at all. Okay, next. Okay, in this case here, I've got a 50-second exposure, and I've got a, I'm trying to think, I put on I think a little stopper, which is a 3-stop. You can see a little bit of the blur in the sky, in the clouds. It's a slight, but it's there. Okay, next. Okay, here's a 40th second, the original one. Here's with the little stopper, and here's a big stopper here. This is a 74 second. The middle one's 50 second. But you notice the effects of the sky and the clouds. There's really nothing happened to the building's the same. But you get this nice wispy clouds. Now, is 50-second good enough for you? Might be. 74 maybe? If the wind was really blowing at 1/40th of a second, you're gonna see a little bit blur in the clouds. But again, depending on the day and the time, you might have something that's really blowing by, and you might be able to do it without any kind of neutral density filters. But in this case here, there was just a whiff of breeze, but I extended to 74 seconds, but you can see the clouds itself. Okay, next. Okay, I went up to f/22. Again, a smaller aperture. I want to limit how much light is in there. I had ISO down at the lowest I could. No filter at all, and I came up with 1/30th of a second for this exposure. And again, with 1/30th of a second, you're not seeing much of a blur in the clouds. Again, they weren't blowing around too much. Next one. Okay, I used a 10 stop here, and with the 10 stop, it went from a 30th of a second to 30 seconds. And you can see the wispy in the clouds above. It's a subtle difference there, but the effect is there. Okay, next. Okay, this is a 16 stop. I took the little stopper and the big stopper back to back, and it ended up to 294 seconds. Okay, and here you can see the clouds. Just kind of blurred. But again, the f/22, ISO 50 extended the time to get the same equivalent exposure to these three. But again, which one do you like better? Do you like the one over to the left, middle, or this one here? The other thing too is, as you know, the clouds aren't the same, minute to minute. They keep changing. Sometimes you might like out getting the right pattern. The direction of the clouds make a difference, and you'll see that in a few minutes. Okay, Steve, next. Okay, so I did something fun. I took this one here and went to a black and white on that.
So, Ray, I'm just trying to process this. So you had to use, so did you use your app to determine the seconds?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Based on the stop that you used?
Right.
Okay.
Yeah. And if you didn't, you can do it trial and error. And the thing is, if you, one stop is double the extension of the time. If you have a 10 second and you double that up, it's 20 seconds. And you double that again, it's 40 seconds. So part of it's your experience. You know what it's going to take. For instance, I had one of them there. I had 1 minute, and I knew it was well underexposed, so I needed to go to a 2 minute or 3 minutes. So in this case here, 294. So this is almost a 5 minute exposure. I had students walking back and forth. But yeah, this is something, I know you've seen pictures like this here, kind of fine art kind of thing, but they're using some heavy duty filters here to get the breeze and the clouds moving like that. Yes, Dick?
Are those pictures taken from the same spot?
Yes.
Because it looks to me like the building on the right is wider than the building on the left, and it's the same thing.
Yeah, it's the same building. I just cropped it a little bit different, that's all.
Okay.
Yeah, that's all. Yeah, it's exactly the same. See the post office truck?
Okay.
Yeah, they're all the same.
Now, Ray, you had said something about there had been people walking back and forth. Now, I have seen something where somebody had mentioned that you can use long exposures to remove, that it'll also get people out.
Well,
of your photo.
Yeah,
If you go long enough.
it's kind of the opposite. Basically, that if they're standing there, there's enough light bouncing them off, it will record that light. But if they're moving by at a normal pace, there's not enough light for that sensor to accumulate to know it's there. So, yeah, the people walking were in front here. Actually, I was shooting over their heads, but there were some on the other side. But if you had people walking, as long as they didn't stop, that had 5 minutes there, they'd have to stand there for at least 2-3 minutes before I probably got a blur image from them. But if you walk by there, you wouldn't see them. There's just not a lot of light coming back. So they're still there, but it's just not being recorded.
I've done some playing around too, where you can, especially like if you want to photograph yourself, you could walk in front of the camera, stand there for a short period of time very still, and then walk off, and you'll get this kind of ghostly image, because you'll be kind of transparent, but you're there. It's kind of fun.
Yeah. In taking Milky Way shots, people have heard of light painting. You might have a tree, and basically you can set your exposure, say after 30 seconds, you can run up there with a light, do a painting on the tree, and then walk out of it. You won't see yourself on it because you're not being exposed that long, but you can see the light because it's much brighter. So yeah, you can actually walk there, paint, and then walk out of it. But if you stand there and do it for 30 seconds, you're going to see your image in there. But for 5-10 seconds, it's not going to record. But yeah, you can do all kinds of things. In fact, I've got a slide coming up. Okay. This one here. Okay. You can do some work with no neutral density filter and fake it in Photoshop using a cloud blur, or you can stack some multiple images and take averages. And this process is in Photoshop that you can take a series of individual shots, meld them together and blend them. It'll look like it's a blur, but yeah, people are interested. That's something new people can do. Okay. Okay, this happens to be a wave movement here. This is 1/10 of a second. This is along the coast. Okay, next. This is no wave movement. Again, this is at the ocean. There's waves coming in. I don't have the time here, but it's probably maybe a minute or a minute or two. But instead of a wavy, it's nice and smooth. Notice the clouds, like I mentioned before, you get lucky with the clouds. If the clouds are moving toward you or away from you, you could get a nice aurora effect. Sometimes the clouds are moving sideways, you really can't do much about it, but in this case here, they have to be moving the right way. Okay? This happened to be a pier, washed out pier, and again, here's the surf going back in the water. People by the beach, anytime you have surf, the so-called trick is to get the surf going back out into the water rather than it coming in, because it trails. Okay. This is a 1 minute exposure. Again, here's some more beach action. Waves coming in. And notice the clouds are going kind of sideways in this case. Okay? I was lucky here the clouds were coming onshore, in this case. 30-second exposure. Okay, next. Another 30 seconds. Again, here's the clouds coming. I don't know if they were coming in or going out, but it had a nice effect. Okay, next. This is another one that was nice cloud effect. Again, sometimes you're just lucky.
Are you ever using your neutral density filter? Or?
Yes, I was using a neutral density, probably a 10 stop on this one. The last several, if you notice, it happened to be in the daytime, actually in the middle of the day almost. So there was plenty of light, so I needed 10 stop to kind of reduce the amount of light coming in the sensor. Sometimes in the morning or in the evening where the light is low, you don't need a 10 stop necessarily. You might get by with a 3 stop or 2 stop. Okay? This happened to be a 4-minute exposure. And again, we get clouds coming in this direction here, but you can't do a whole lot about the cloud. If you're there, you take it and hope the best. But again, here's a beach here. Everything looks smooth. It's a 4-minute exposure. Okay? Yeah, this is what my grandkids, there's 2 of them here. They both have a flashlight with 2 different colors here. And they ended up walking from left to right, doing some swirls. They had fun with that. See the Milky Way above it? But this was a 20-second exposure, and it took us about 3 or 4 times to do it, to get something like this here. To start from one end to here. I want to make sure I got them in the screen. But in 20 seconds, they were able to do that. But that's kind of fun. I didn't use any neutral density filters here because it was dark enough, so didn't have to worry about that. But it's still a long exposure. Okay, next. Autumn's here. This particular shot happened to be at Dawson Lake. And what I was trying to do is getting the leaves that were in the edge of the lake. It was swirling. This is I want to say a 10 stop. Okay. Here's another one by a lakeside here. We have some leaves being blown and we're getting light reflected off. Again, this is probably a 10 stop. Again, you've got to fool around with it because you might have a good breeze coming in and these leaves might be going pretty fast. In this case, it was kind of a light breeze, so they were kind of moving slow. So you had to kind of time it to get a good enough blur on them to get that effect. Okay, next. This is the springtime. This is the national grasslands. And here's some wildflowers there being blown around. Because everybody knows springtime there's a lot of wind. But I decided to take a long exposure, getting the flowers moving around. But here's the fence posts in the fence, and some of the other taller flowers are pretty stationary. Okay. Night star tracks, skies. There's a comet here. Again, that's a time exposure. Again, no neutral density filters needed because it's plenty dark enough. Okay. Yeah, this is kind of fun. This happens to be a panorama. This is a local county fair. Okay, next. When the lights go down, you can have fun taking shots of the rides. And again, you have to fool around with it and decide what kind of exposure time you need because these rides are moving at different speeds. Okay, next. In this case here, these are the same ride here, but this particular case, this went up to the top and it hesitated for a split second. This one here is coming down, it's moving much faster. But I used the same exposure time on both. But again, you've got to play around with it and decide, okay, which one do you like best, and maybe take multiples and see what's right. But you see the ride on the bottom here, the exposure is about the same for both of them, but the ride itself is accelerating. Okay? Here's some more. Okay, next. This wheel, the Ferris wheel, had multiple colors changing during the cycle, so it's kind of nice to get a few different shots of that. Okay. some more.
So you
Okay.
just carried your tripod around, there's people everywhere, and
Yeah, I actually had a tripod, and I actually went to the backside out of the way. Usually there's a line in the front where I went in the back, kind of an area that you could walk. I wasn't trespassing or anything, but I got out of the way and stood back. I had a zoom, so I could stand back a ways and kind of zoom into it. Okay? Okay, again, this is artistic choice. This is 1/60th of a second. Okay, anybody know what that is?
Is it in Maine?
Yep. Portland had, this is a 6-second exposure. And if you go back, this one, okay? What I was trying to do is get it, time it, so the waves would be crashing on the rocks here all the way around to get that, you know, white foamy perimeter. And the next here, okay, and I was trying to do that again with a longer exposure so you can get more of that frothy look. Okay, trick question, how many lighthouses do you see?
2.
2. Now there's one out here. That's Ram's Head Light. There's
What's the
another one
name?
around the corner, but there's a way you can get 3 lighthouses in one picture.
What's the name of the big one?
This is Portland Head Light. Okay. This happens to be a stream. This happens to be at end of December in Connecticut. I kind of like this here because I can see the reflection of the leaf. The leaf is underwater, stuck on a rock. But here's a half a second. Okay, next. This is what I did about maybe an hour or so ago. Normal exposure, 1/13th of a second. This is the golf course at Lake of the Woods. This is a 60-second exposure, and here's a 2-minute exposure. See the difference in the clouds? And again, the clouds happen to be moving pretty quick. But if you ever see a picture like this here with clouds like this, chances are it was a long exposure of some sort. Or somebody did something in Photoshop and, you know, fooled around with it. But, okay, next. Yeah, this is stream. This is a 1/4 of a second. I tell you, I like a slower shutter speed, but you can see these ripples a little more contrasting than having something that's a 30-second, where it would look like foam or sugar. You can see a little more detail on the movement of the water with a slower exposure time. Okay? Next. This is a longer one. This is a mountain stream, Georgia. Okay, next. Okay, this is, again, Joseph photographer. This is LaSalle and St. Louis Canyons. Both of these are a little bit longer exposure time. Okay. This one here is a little bit longer one, only because of it didn't have a high flow. If I took one, 1 or 2 seconds, you wouldn't see as much water, but I let it go for maybe 30 seconds, might have been longer than that, because as the flow comes down, it kind of moves side to side, so it would have more of an effect if I have a longer exposure. But again, it's something you have to decide on the spot. Take a look at it. Okay, next. Under here, and again, you got to guess how fast the water's coming in. Take a number of shots. Half second, 2 seconds. Okay, next. This is fun here. This is a street. Taking exposures, cars going down the street. Okay, Susan, I think you were talking about, you see any cars in this one?
No.
There's no cars. I took them out. No, actually the car is there, but again, it's dark. It doesn't have a lot of light that's reflecting. You see the headlights? So that's what's fun about some of these pictures here, because you can have fun doing all kinds of crazy things with it. Okay, next. This would happen to be an ISU. I got to confess, these are stacked. I was in the overpass, and what happened was lights on both ends, and the lights were coordinated where I would get the cars coming toward me, and there was nothing going out, so I'd have to wait for the cars going out. There was nothing coming toward me, so I took a shot of both conditions and blended them in both cases, so that way there you have it coming and going. But this is looking west, this is looking east. I basically turned around and looked at the other direction. But 30-second exposure. This again at the ocean. Okay, next. Okay, next. Timing the waves coming in. Next. Some more waves. And again, it's all trial and error. You try it and see what happens. Okay, next. I was trying to time it where I had the waves breaking up over this old pier, so you can see some effect here. They weren't high enough, but you can still see the movement of the waves. Next. Again, going back to your review, shutter speed, you want a quarter second or longer. It's really up to you. If you have neutral density filters, you can extend that from a quarter second to 2 seconds, 5 seconds, 20 seconds, 30, a minute, 2 minutes. A couple of them I showed tonight, I had 5 minutes. You got to work with your aperture here. I typically will go to a smaller aperture, letting less light in. In ISO, I'll probably get as low as I can. So you want to limit how much light here, and then fool around with your shutter speed and see what you can get. Adding your neutral density filter there, if you have it, to make some changes, and again, you hope for the best and see what you have. Okay, next. Okay, next. I thought this would be short, but okay. But here you can see the striations in the clouds. Okay, next. Okay, here it is. Thank you. Any questions?
You set your aperture and then your ISO. You see what the shutter speed would be without the neutral density filter. Then you use the app and then you dial in that and see what it would be with it. And then you put the neutral density filter on your camera.
Right, yeah. I know that I can't get any lower than 50 ISO. If you have a Nikon, it's 64. I like to start there because, that's a baseline. As far as the aperture goes, I might start with 16 and go up to 22 if I need it, because we're limiting how much light, and then play around with the exposure and see what you have. And then again, I've got a few different neutral density lenses here, so I can decide whether to go to a 2-stop, 3-stop, 6-stop, 10-stop, or even double up if I need to. But again, it's case-by-case basis. If you're in the middle of the day, there's a lot of light available, you want to cut that down quite a bit. You might need a lot of filters. This happens to be sunrise, of course. I probably use 2-stop filter in this one, perhaps. I'm just guessing. So, what has to do with your ambient conditions? It's a lot easier to do it an overcast day, for instance, than a day that's a lot of sun, bright sunshine. Okay. Any comments, questions? Anybody done this before, or? No? This would be fun for you, Alan, if you go up to Lake Michigan. You know, especially with the water.
Yeah, the biggest problem I have up there is there's nothing out in the water. So it's just, you know, I have to find a place where there's some rocks or something.
Yeah, or a lighthouse.
Yeah, I could walk.
Find a lighthouse and.
Yeah, yeah.
But yeah. Yeah, it doesn't work well with boats that are moored out there, because what happens, they tend to be moving around too. You get a blur. But, you know, sometimes it's worth it. So it's all abstract, so, you know, it depends what you feel like and what looks good.
Yeah, I've had fun in Chicago too, especially if you can get up in a building and shoot down on the streets
Right,
at night.
yeah. Or you get on one of the bridges and shoot down the river,
Yeah.
especially at night or at dusk, for instance. Okay.
Do you have any trouble overheating your sensor when you get up in that 2, 5, 10-minute range?
I have not, but I haven't used my mirrorless. I've got a mirrorless. I haven't used that for long exposures, and I probably would not, only because I'd be, you know, concerned about that. But I would use my DSLR for that. Anybody have an experience with mirrorless? Yeah, I like my mirrorless, and I use it for certain things, but for long exposure, I shouldn't say that. I've used it for Milky Way, but again, I'm talking about 20, 30 seconds at the most. I don't go beyond that. But for 2 minutes, 3, 4, 5 minutes, I haven't tried. I'm scared. Any more questions? Okay. Steve, you pass in the quiz? You gonna pass the quiz around?
Maybe some of us want to look at their equipment. So.
Yeah, I've got some filters up here in the setup. If anybody wants to come up, you turn the lights on and.
Are there some other business type announcements we want to take care of?
I guess the biggest announcement is the fire photographer next meeting. That'll be down at the Fire Institute, and we've been sending out regular emails on that. We do need RSVPs on that so we can make sure we don't go over the limit. I don't think we'll have a problem with that, but to be safe, we need RSVPs, and we are allowing you to bring one guest. So that's the biggest announcement. We are working on a drone photography talk, and that'll be December 13th. There'll be some more details coming out on that in the next few weeks as we get that solidified. And and then we are planning tentatively our fall outing on October 23rd. Is that the Saturday? Yeah. And there'll be some more details coming out on that as well. So.
Does anybody have any preference or thoughts about where to go?
I don't know, we were down at Walnut Point over the weekend, and also Lincoln Trail, and I would say out of 100, there's about 2.
Well,
I mean, anywhere, I don't know, I would just pick our favorite spot. Usually last year, Walnut Point was pretty good.
Yeah.
I just got time for that.
What is the date? Oh, 23rd.
23rd, yeah.